In this video, I'm going to show you how to find target notes to improve your solos, and I'm going to use Dexter Gordon's Cheesecake as the example. Hi, I'm Donna from DonnaSchwartzMusic.com, the site to boost your music performance and improvisation skills up to the next level. I would love it if you tap that subscribe button and tap that bell to get notified when new videos come out each and every week. Finding the target notes will improve your soloing because it's going to help you to outline the important notes of the chord. Now, in previous videos, I talk about what those notes are in relation to each chord, so definitely check out the links I have in the description below. Now, when you outline and when you find those target notes, it helps the solo flow more smoothly. It gives it kind of like a direction, okay? It's different than what a lot of people feel, where they feel like they're just running up and down a scale or running up and down chord tones. No, it's knowing where to go. And I'm going to use a sports analogy. Think of baseball. Think of a pitcher and a catcher. Well, if the pitcher and the catcher are not on the same terms in terms of knowing what type of pitch is going to be thrown, it's going to be a mess, and someone's just going to get clocked in the head. So the pitcher needs to know where to throw the ball. Just like when you're playing a solo, you need to know what direction you're going. And it's a step beyond knowing what the chords are. It's knowing what are the notes that I really want to emphasize within each chord so that I could make the solo flow more smoothly and tell a story, bring it to the next dimension. You could also call this voice leading. Now, you don't want to approach soloing by just blowing random notes and hoping that your solos will sound good. So if you practice improvisation by following these steps I'm going to outline for you and think about how you're going to approach your improvisations for each tune, you're going to have much more success. Step number 1, identify the chords in the song. Identify the notes that make up each chord in the song. Now, if you need to, take out a piece of paper and write it out. You notice how I said write it out as opposed to going to Muse Score or going to Noteflight or Finale or Sibelius and typing it out. No, write it out. The act of writing it out is going to further reinforce which notes are in which chord, and it's going to help you remember that and help you with muscle memory in terms of remembering the chord tones. Now, if you don't need to do this, that's perfectly fine. Step number 2, you want to identify and also play the guide tones. Now, when I say the guide tones, these are the notes, basically the thirds and the sevenths that are in each chord. Now, sometimes, especially in this tune, in Cheesecake, there are some chords like, for example, a C minor 6, 9. So that means that there's no 7 in there. It means that there's C, E flat, G, A natural, and D. Okay, so the A would be one of the guide tones. That would be, the 6 would be replacing the 7. So what you'd want to do, and if you need to write this out, you can certainly do that, but identify the guide tones for each of the chords that you either worked on or wrote out by hand. Now, ideally, you would want to play this with either the original performance or with a backing track. And ideally also, if you're able to slow down that backing track if you need to, so you could really hear how each guide tone sounds within each chord. Now, keep in mind, the guide tones that I wrote down, that you're going to see in a second, I did not connect these thirds to the sevenths, the typical voice leading. I just wrote down the guide tones so that you can see them. Now, I only played the lower notes of the guide tones. Okay, so the way I have it written out in my PDF is that the thirds are on the bottom, the sixths or the sevenths are on top. Now, if you want access to all the stuff that you're going to be seeing on the screen, head on over to my Patreon site at patreon.com/DonnaSchwartzMusic, where you're going to see this lesson and all the PDFs. And for a small monthly donation, which helps to support my YouTube videos each and every week, you get access to not only the PDFs from this lesson, but PDFs where I have the lick of the month, where I have blues licks, where I have other video lessons that are not shown anywhere else. Okay, step number 3, you want to identify the pitches, the tones that you do want to connect, and you want to do that beforehand. So in other words, you don't want to have the horn in your mouth while you're trying to figure out the connections, unless, of course, you're at a level where you could identify the chord tones really quickly. Now, if you need to, you could absolutely take pencil and paper, and write it out. Write out those connecting chord tones. Now, so far, we've outlined the chords, we've outlined the guide tones, and then we've outlined some connections. We thought about the connections first, and if we needed to, we wrote it out, pencil and paper, and we played them. And we played them with the backing track. Okay, now that's obviously not a solo, right? We're working, we're doing exercises, improvisation exercises. So the next step is also going to be an exercise, and step number 4 is going to be to think about scale tones, okay? Scale tones that apply to each chord and that can bridge the gap between some of the chord tones. Now, could you do a chord tone solo? Yeah, for sure, okay? But those aren't really, that's not how people normally solo, okay? We want to be more melodic, we want to use scale degrees, we would be using chromaticism, all that type of thing. But this step 4, what you'll want to do, and if you need to write it out, you can do that, is start with a particular chord tone and then using scale tones to try to bridge the gap between chord tones, but also to bridge the gap between one chord to another. So let me play an example. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so now that you've worked on the chord tones, worked on the guide tones, worked on planning out the connections between the chords, and also planning the connections using scale tones, now step 5 is basically putting it all together. Now, here's a tip for you. What you can do is take those connections that you pre-planned, let's say the scale connections, and you could start to add notes that fall in between. You can add some chromaticisms there, other chord tones, and vary up the rhythms instead of just playing quarter notes all the time. And that can be, an etude that you can come up with. Another tip that you can do is if you really need to do this is optional, if you really feel the need to do this, is to write out an etude. So maybe use the scale connections or even the chord connections that you planned out and write out an etude and vary up the rhythms. But make sure it's something that you're able to play. Like, don't write something crazy that will be too hard for you to play. But here's an important point. Be sure to not think that writing out the etude is your improvisation. Okay, improvisation is essentially taking all the vocabulary you have, all the knowledge you have, and creating a solo right there, having a conversation right there. Memorizing a written etude is basically memorizing a written etude. It's not necessarily an improvisation, so please keep that in mind. All right, so here's my example. And that is how you find the target notes to help improve your solos through those various steps. Now, again, if you want access to those PDFs, to that etude, definitely go over to my Patreon site, patreon.com/DonnaSchwartzMusic, where you'll not only get this lesson with the PDFs, but you'll get a whole bunch of other great stuff that I don't put out anywhere else. Did you like this lesson? Give it a like and subscribe to my channel. And also, don't forget, tap that bell to be notified when new videos come out each and every week. Thanks for joining me. On that note, take care. Have a great day.